Welcome back. Episode 2 of the Hyde Park Barracks in Sydney, Australia. Or as you'll hear me say from time to time, the Sydney Barracks. We left off with a convict town, Sydney. Once again, some use of the map. This section here is known as the Rocks, and you have what is now the beautiful Opera House of Sydney located at the tip of this peninsula, and the Hyde Park Barracks located in this zone of the city center. And a convict town was built by English and Irish convicts who were sentenced by the British courts. And the barracks was, as I mentioned in the previous episode, was not necessarily or technically a prison. It was secured accommodations where they were held overnight, where they slept in hammocks, had 2 meals a day, and then they went out and built what is now known as the City of Australia. And we mentioned Surrey Hills, which now is a very lively entertainment district with great restaurants and entertainment. It was an early manufacturing hub. Make bricks and tiles, good quality clay. Potteries were made there, earthenware, crockery, and clay pipes. Further south, Carter Barracks, where the Central Railway is now, housed a gang of convict carters who cared for teams of horses and delivered goods around town from the dockyard. Convict boys were also lodged here and trained in various trades. Now, this is an opportunity to explore the history of Australia. Convict boys, are you suggesting that teenagers, both male and female, were placed on these transportation ships from England and Ireland? Yes, that was the case. Now, allow me to step back as a sociologist and remind the audience that we are now honing in on a very important demographic item that I refer to as depopulation coupled with repopulation. And that is a lot of these European powers, whether they be British, Portuguese, Spanish, were intent on depopulating the lands that they conquered and repopulating them with European people. US, Australia. I have also studied this phenomenon in Argentina, which will be a series of episodes later in this schedule of programming. Convict boys were also lodged here and trained in various trades. Now, this is another important aspect of a convict society, because a lot of these convicts from English and Irish cities, or I should say towns or rural areas, really were not that well skilled. In a very informative and epic treatment of Australia is the amazing book, The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes. And he makes all these points. So I mention Hughes and other historians will talk about, because they provide an in-depth narrative of what is identified here as the convict town and the convict society and the penal colony. Let's move ahead. 2 meals a day, porridge, some bread, some water. Nothing fancy about that. Enough calories to keep them working through these long days. I should mention, by way of Robert Hughes, that the life of a penal convict was structured by way of the British courts. It was regulated by the number of hours one was required to work throughout the week. And according to Hughes and other historians, many of those work weeks were around 54 hours. Now, if you compare that to the modern and postmodern society we live in now, many professionals routinely rack up between 54 and 60 hours. Many of us know that firsthand. So with these extra hours they had in their work week, many of those who were well behaved on their free time would be permitted to go into the area of the rocks, for example, and they could sell their labor. They could find some guy who was building a pub and say, hey, I can give you 6 hours of labor if you compensate me either with cash or with various goods. We can make a deal. And that was perfectly legitimate in the convict society. More about that later. Try on a convict uniform. I mentioned in the first episode that these are storytelling institutions, and among the repertoire of techniques is performance. And the idea is to have curators reach out and engage visitors as participants in the larger phenomenon of penal tourism. And this provides some transition from how the convict arrived, how he was then provided with a uniform, how that uniform then makes its way into the prison museum, and how the visitor makes the connection by trying it on and get their photograph taken. It's all a performance, folks. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just pointing it out. Road gangs, road parties. That is not to suggest that they're having a good time. But let's explore. Let's look at the illustration first. This gives you an idea of what these men, these teenagers, look like being patrolled by British military, naval officers who are armed with weapons, rifles, bayonets. And you have these working class, working poor people from England and Ireland. And they're expanding. This is almost the equivalent of the American version of Manifest Destiny, just moving civilized European-based society into the wilderness and beyond. Curators provide some texts that allow us to consider these developments. Convicts who reoffended after arriving in the colony could be assigned to punishment gangs and the hard labor of building and repairing roads and bridges. The worst offenders were sentenced to iron gangs who toiled in leg irons and were locked up in portable jails each night. Governor Darling liked to describe reoffending convicts as double distilled villains. These men were badly behaved, and many of their crimes were work-related, refusing to work, absconding and stealing materials and tools. That was very common because, once again, the Rocks, for example, that area, there were hotels or restaurants being under construction, and very often one of these convicts who would have perhaps lifted a hammer, stole a hammer from a work site, would then go to one of these construction sites in the Rocks, and then he would make a deal. That was a common form of low-level criminal activity in the convict society. By 1829, almost 1,000 convict men were building roads at the edges of the settlement. 253 men on the road to the south, 320 in the western to Bathurst, 400 to the north road to the Hunter Valley. Some of those who managed to escape from the road and bridge building gangs became bushrangers, a risky move, and the penalty for bushranging was death. Well, we're going to hear more about the bushrangers because they have become part of the cultural narrative and heritage of Australian society. These are men who bolt from the work site, survive in the bush, as they say, in the wilderness, and then would mug those who had horses. They would then steal their horse, they would then steal their weapons, and then they would live life OTR, on the run. We can talk about that more at another point. And this is the canary suit. For those high-risk convicts who had escaped and were deemed a high flight risk, would be clothed in this ridiculous-looking canary uniform so they could be spotted from afar, from a distance, by the guards. It was also a form of humiliation. And as you've heard me comment in these other videos, lectures, and episodes, humiliation is one feature of punishment. It's the psychological, emotional, mental feature of punishment. Let's pause there, get another cup of coffee, come back, and talk more about the Sydney Barracks.